our department, or at least we're very proud to
Woo!
have her graduate. I think she's a big supporter of the department as well. She's had a spectacular career, a lot of it spent in the financial sector, which made her a ideal speaker on this particular topic. She is at the moment the Vice President and Global Head of Sustainability at Scotiabank. And prior to that, she spent a few years at Canada, Carbon Canada, Carbon Management Canada, excuse me on that one. So a smaller startup. So she's seen it from that side as well. So I thought that combined experience would really lead to a very interesting talk. And I can see from the large number of people who've shown up that we're all looking forward to that. So I won't delay any further. And I'll pass it over to Sandra. Looking forward to this present. Oh, and we got lots of hands up there too. So there we go.
Hands up already?
Hands up already. That's right.
Wait, what?
Yes.
Should I start or
Go
jump
ahead.
right into Q&A?
Yes, don't Q&A. Start while you're ahead. That's right. Now go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much, Greg. And yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to join your seminar today. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be a proud alumni of U of T and University of Ottawa, where I did my undergrad. So I will just say that. But you know, the one near and dear to my heart is the one in my home, my new adopted hometown, which is of course Toronto. So delighted to be here, and yeah, really happy that so many people are interested in understanding what is the role of finance in this topic that seems to be the hot thing, which is ESG, and particularly in recent months and in the last year, and particularly since COP26, this idea of net zero. So what I wanted to do is give you an overview of what we do and what we talk about more broadly around ESG at Scotiabank. Just take a couple of minutes on that, and then kind of give you the context for a deeper dive into climate change and net zero. And the reason I want to start with the ESG picture is because it might help to answer that question about the role of finance and how this fits into our broader strategic frameworks on how we deal with sustainability and it's a fraternal twin, ESG. So just a thing about Scotiabank, if you're not familiar with Scotiabank, the thing that's different perhaps between Scotiabank and the other big five banks really is that we do have a fair footprint in Latin America. Although, you know, about 68% of our profits do come from Canada, almost 20% is from the Pacific Alliance countries. Scotiabank is among the Canadian banks, it's the third largest by assets, with about 1.2 trillion in assets as of the end of the last fiscal year. One of the things that I always find interesting in banking is that the scale of the numbers that you deal with is just really, really, really big. So in terms of ESG at Scotiabank, the way we look at this is just a fancy way of showing really a 4x3 matrix for all of you engineers and nerds in the audience like me. But really what we've got is a bit of a hybrid between a conventional sustainability as well as you know, the ESG framework, in that we look at our approach across four pillars. So the traditional sustainability pillars of environment, economy, and society, but we've also got leadership and governance in there, and arguably that could be the one that's cross-cutting across the top. But the bottom line is, it is something that many of our stakeholders also consider an important indicator of, you know, non-financial performance, and arguably all of these things have an impact on financial performance. And when we look at environment, economy, society, and governance, we plan our strategies and we frame this in terms of what are we doing across these four areas within our own operations and our workplace, with our customers. So obviously our products, our services, our advice, our financial services and advice, and then our communities or the world around us. So our external stakeholders. I'm going to actually just do a tiny detour there and just address the question that I often get, which is ESG really the same as corporate sustainability? So I think the answer is sort of, but it really depends who you're talking to. I'm finding that increasingly people are using the terms interchangeably, but as the group on this call may already know, they have very different pedigree and different nuances to them. So certainly ESG obviously stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it was really a term coined, actually, someone I know at the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative claims that he coined the term personally around 2004, 2005. But I think it was a group of us who were involved in finance and sustainability in the early days and recognized that for analysts who were traditionally just looking at the financial aspects of any company's performance, but certainly for those of us in finance, that we wanted to make sure people understood you also had to, in addition to looking at the financial performance, there were material issues on the environmental, social, and governance front that, if ignored, could have a material impact on a company's performance. So hence, the governance part, nobody needed convincing on, but it was very clever to layer in environmental and social and combine the three terms to make sure that this this framework and this lens was something that became part of the standard operating toolkit for analysts over time. Sustainability has been around for longer, and of course, as you know, it's an approach to business that aims to create long-term value by making sure that we're always looking at the social, environmental, and economic dimensions of doing business and making sure that we understand how they interact when we make decisions about long-term success, not just for business, but for society in general. So they're kind of the same and they overlap, but ESG I look at as much more of an analyst's and investor's lens, and corporate sustainability is much more of a strategic lens that would be used equally by a nation as much as by a small business hoping to have a good long-term strategy. So when we look at our strategic framework, in terms of what do we mean by, we look at it in our operations, our customers, our world around us. And by the way, this is not necessarily unique to Scotiabank in terms of how we think about sustainability and ESG issues. Um, you know, in our operations, these are things like reducing our environmental footprint, managing our supply chain, the workplace things like diversity and inclusion commitments and targets. Project Shadow is this initiative that we're doing in our risk management and analytics teams using anti-money laundering artificial intelligence tools that banks use to identify patterns that indicate human trafficking and child smuggling and things like that in certain regions. So we're involved in some national and international initiatives around that. So that's arguably both a community, so in the world around us, but it's also something very much anchored in the way that we manage anti-money laundering. With our customers, of course, products and services and advice, that is the core of why we exist, but what's the lens in terms of offering those with a social imperative or environmental or other types of community benefits embedded with a legitimate financial product or service. And then last but not least, we do a lot of work in communities. Up until December, I was also overseeing our community investment portfolio, which was about $58 million a year, and then add on to that another 20 or 30 million in kind and community sponsorship type things. So banks are fairly large community donors and have committed to the Imagine commitment, which is 1% of profit to charity. So how do we set priorities? I mean, there's a lot of environmental, social, and governance or sustainability issues out there. So again, in terms of large corporations, and particularly in finance, it's very common to approach it from the rigor of a materiality assessment. So really what this is you start with your long list of potential considerations, things that people might be interested in from an environmental, social, governance perspective, things that your own business competitive instincts tell you are things you should be looking at. From that long list, you then sort of map them out on an optimization curve. So you end up looking at how do these different potential sustainability issues map onto small to large impact on your actual business performance. Is the horizontal axis in the right-hand side of this slide, and the vertical axis would be how do these map in terms of importance to your stakeholders, importance to society and the environment. So when you map those out, the upper right-hand corner is where you would tend to prioritize your efforts. These are things that you would address certainly in your reporting, but you would also address these most critically in your strategic planning. And so for us, when we did this exercise with a range of internal and external stakeholders, we found that the things that sort of have the double whammy impact of being largely impactful on our business, as well as very important to stakeholders, is how are we managing the potential environmental and social impacts of our lending and financing? What are we doing about employee health and well-being? And what are we doing about data privacy? And then the second level, which are also important, so those are the green boxes on this 2x2 chart on the right, are the additional issues that you see listed here. So certainly climate change is a biggie, business ethics, diversity, equity, and inclusion, financial inclusion and access, disruptive technologies, and then similar to the question about what are the impacts of your lending and financing, but slightly less aggressively pursued by our stakeholders, but still interesting, is what are the impacts of your asset management and wealth management approaches. So we use this to tailor our strategies and our disclosures. This is just a bit of a laundry list of some of the priorities that we focused on in 2021, just to give you a sense of it. So a couple that I would flag, and I'm going to talk further about the climate and net zero one. But one of the biggies was how are we mobilizing capital, additional capital, to address climate change? And what are we doing to map out a net zero pathway? On the social front, really this year was the year, 2021, sorry, was the year to build on the January 21 launch of our Scotia Rise initiative. So that's a $500 million over 10 years to support initiatives that contribute to economic resilience anywhere that we do business. So one of our signature partnerships is with a really cool not-for-profit called Windmill Microlending, which I would encourage you to look into if you haven't heard of them. They were actually founded in Calgary as the Immigrant Access Fund some time ago, and since anchored in Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, and Montreal. And what they do is provide microloans to professionals who come to Canada and need some breathing room so that they can, sometimes it's just so they can pay childcare or pay for their accreditation courses or whatever it takes to move them up from usually from earning minimum wage in something that is not their chosen profession to ramping right up into the middle class within a very short amount of time, because they can use this microloan for anything they want for a couple of years, and they get the mentorship and support to get into their chosen profession in Canada. Amazing, amazing organization and initiative. So we're very proud to be a supporter of that. And then on governance and leadership, it's been all about policy and governance structures being put in place over the last year to make sure that we can continue to deliver on strategic priorities. Scotiabank does quite well in a lot of third-party ratings, so MSCI and the Carbon Disclosure Project and a whole bunch of these. There's a growing list of, we call them rankers and spankers, who do ESG ratings. All of them rating and weighting things differently makes it very interesting for everyone, and also a topic of hot conversation when it comes to, well, how do you know what to believe? Well, I think part of it is because some of these issues are subjective, and the ones that really matter, the financially material, environmental and social issues, don't need separate ratings agencies because they're embedded in your actual annual financial reporting. But that's a whole other presentation. So what I'd like to talk about next is jump into talking about climate change and the bank's approach to net zero. So this is essentially, we look at this as one of the wedges in the signature program area in our environmental action area. Again, don't have to tell you guys this. Yes, it's getting hot in here. Average temperature change, no matter, what credible, organizations you look at, there's no question that the average global temperature is going up. And not coincidentally, same thing for CO2 concentration, not conversation. So this is, again, you've probably seen this, but these are based on ice core samples. So we're up by 40% since 1740, which is a lot. Obviously, we've overshot 400 ppm a couple of years ago. And this one I find most interesting, looking at, again, from Scripps, looking at CO2 conversation going back 10,000 years. And then this was from 2018, and then you just look at that last little tiny sliver on the right-hand side of the chart, it's actually super disturbing, I think. And then, of course, those crunchy granola, tree-hugging insurance adjusters and insurance analysts are seeing that they're raising, in fact, insurance companies were among the first in the financial sector to raise the alarm about the evidence of climate change. So even when you adjust for the fact that concentration of buildings in certain areas changes over time, et cetera, there's definitely been a significant increase in weather-related disasters year on year since they've been tracking, and this is worrisome, obviously. So just a recap on where did GHG emissions come from? So this is globally, GHG emissions, basically half of GHG emissions come from two things. It comes from electricity and heat production, and it comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And then the third biggest chunk, of course, being emissions from industry. Interestingly, in Canada, it looks a little bit different. So in Canada, our biggest emissions source, again, this is 2017, so there may be a little bit of adjustments on the margins, but the biggest source of emissions is certainly the oil and gas sector, like direct emissions from that sector. And then second biggest is transportation. And then for us, third is it's pretty much a tie between the emissions associated with buildings. So the built environment is a big contributor to GHGs. And then, of course, electricity for Canada is smaller than in a lot of other parts of the world because our electricity grid is quite low emitting and getting even lower all the time until they shut down Darlington. But that's, again, another presentation. So the thing that's really challenging about what's going on in climate, and again, just a bit of a recap for a lot of folks on this call, is that we know that to adjust emissions down to meet a pathway. So the green curve is how do we make sure that we're on a pathway for maximum average global temperature increase to not overshoot 2 degrees Celsius? What would it take to do that? Well, the green curve shows you what would have to happen to emissions. What's currently in nationally determined commitments, NDCs, so every country submits their, what their country's planning to do to support the endeavors of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the current, at least in 2015, and again, it's changed a bit, but not that much, we're currently on track to a 3.5 degree temperature increase, given the policies that have been announced. It looks grim, but as you can see, it's actually, it's still a big flattening of the curve compared to if we don't do anything, which means we're aiming for a temperature increase of over 4 degrees C by 2100, which brings with it a whole bunch of really alarming and in some cases devastating impacts in certain parts of the world. So the challenge is not small. Basically, we're on the blue path, more or less. Our policies have us on the red path, which is still shows an increase in emissions over time and a big temperature increase. And we're supposed to be on the green path. And in fact, subsequent to this, other pathways have been modeled that have us trying to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which, as you can imagine, slope even more sharply downward, which creates an even bigger gap between reality and what we need to be doing. So what do we need to be doing? I just want to sum up if you remember nothing else, and again, apologies for all those people who already know this, I always tell my team, there's really 5 things that you got to remember. No matter what, this is how we're going to get there. And these are all hard to do. Number 1 is we have to decarbonize electricity. Number 2 is then we have to electrify everything. That means we have to run as many things as possible on the clean electricity that we are generating. It means changing the way that we do transportation. It means changing the way that we heat and cool our homes. It means changing the way that we run manufacturing and industrial facilities. To the extent possible, we need to run these things on clean electricity. We also need zero emission transport. It's related to the clean emitting electricity, but not always. In some cases, particularly for trucking, it has to do with a lot of work being done, for example, on hydrogen powered heavy transport. But the bottom line is that internal combustion engines are a really big problem for hitting global CO2 targets. And then, of course, we have to decarbonize industrial processes. So both in terms of thinking through the processes themselves, but also, as discussed before, maybe running them on different sources of energy and looking at efficiencies, et cetera. And then, of course, aggressive improvements on energy efficiency, whether it's for buildings or industrial processes. This, by the way, is if you have ever been to Vancouver, this is the LEED Platinum, the newish convention center that looks toward the North Shore in Vancouver. So that brings us to, what does this all mean for a bank? So what can a bank do? What is the role of the financial sector? So when we look at the ways that the financial sector, and particularly in banking, because of course financial services includes things like insurance and wealth management and asset management, but I'm going to focus mostly on the core business area of banking. So there's really 5 pillars or 5 areas of activity, and those sort of framed the Scotiabank climate commitments, which came out about 2 years ago as our strategic framework. So number 1 is you've got to make sure you've got the right kind of governance and transparency. So do you have the systems in place? And I talked about that a bit in our 2021 priorities, putting in place executive level ESG councils that bring the executives from all different nooks and crannies of the bank to make sure that everybody's tracking on the strategic direction that this is going in and what it means for their varied business or functional units. And then also you being transparent about the way that you're talking about it, both inside and outside the organization. In terms of really important pillars of activity, so number 1, of course, for a bank is, how are you mobilizing capital? What are you financing to actually address climate change mitigation, and in some cases, climate change adaptation? But we set a target 2 years ago about mobilizing at least 100 billion by 2025 towards reducing not just the impacts of climate change. Actually, that's a typo. So the causes and impacts of climate change. As of fiscal year end, which is October 31st, we had already hit 58 billion mobilized. So these are things like green, helping companies issue green bonds, helping providing loans and financing to LEED certified buildings, renewable power projects, massive energy efficiency retrofits of both industrial and industrial, commercial, and real estate related installations, etc. So mobilizing capital, it's what we do. So that's a big pillar for a bank in terms of activity. The second big pillar in banking, of course, is risk management, because that's the other thing banks do, is that they are really, really, really good, and it's the reason why they're really good and that they're around for hundreds of years, at least in Canada, is they're really good at managing risk. So the question, though, is, how are we integrating the management of climate-related issues into our risk frameworks? So how are we integrating the physical effects of climate change, for example, when we look at the credit risk, the operational risk, market risk, all the risks that we know how to manage, this newish thing that's causing ripples in the world called climate change, both from a physical perspective, but also a transition perspective, i.e., new regulations, new market realities, new consumer expectations, all those kind of transitionally related things about climate change. How do those things affect your counterparty's credit risk profile? How does it affect your own business's operational risk? Those kinds of things are increasingly now integrated into the way that we do our risk management work. And then the third pillar, which isn't inconsequential, because in Canada, banks are very, very large companies with a lot of physical assets and a very large supply chain, is how are we decarbonizing our own operations? That's another big pillar of our approach to to the net zero transition. And then underpinning this is how are we making sure that we're collaborating, we're engaging, we've got the right kind of research underway, we're forming the right partnerships with a range of stakeholders, not the least of which is government and policymakers, but certainly with think tanks, with our clients, and in-house, making sure that our people are well informed and up to speed on what's going on in this. Some of the progress in this, so I already touched on across the top. So the mobilizing capital, we're at 58 billion as of end of fiscal. In terms of the governance and reporting pillar, we've initiated this cross-bank effort last year in February to assess pathways to net zero, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We adapted new processes to calculate our credit exposure and the amount of our financed emissions, which isn't perfectly correlated with risk necessarily, but it's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. So does the amount of emissions of your client base correlate in any way to risk to the bank in terms of credit risk? So we're taking, all the banks are looking at that, as are the regulators. Decarbonizing our own operations. We've just committed that we're going to be procuring 100% emission-free electricity globally. So remember, we're also in South America and the Caribbean, as well as Canada and the US. So we're going to be 100% non-emitting electricity by 2030 globally, and actually within a couple of years here in Canada. In terms of Climate Center of Excellence, a whole bunch of things, but one of the things that's been really important is making sure that our own employees have the right level of knowledge about climate change and the right tools available to them should they need them. So a bit of a spotlight on net zero. So in February, we launched our Net Zero Pathways project. And really one of the starting points was to estimate our baseline of our portfolio GHG emissions. So another word for these are downstream scope 3 emissions, and also known as financed emissions. So these are basically the emissions associated with our clients' emissions, and then kind of apportioned to us in relation to how much our financing is relative to the total amount of financing that company might receive from all sources. So what we're doing is wanting to look at what kind of targets could we set so that we could eventually be net zero by 2050, not just in our own operations, of course, but also in our financed emissions. So the project involved a number of different steps, and the result of it is that we want to be carbon neutral or net zero in our own operations by 2030, and with financed emissions by 2050. We want to be able to disclose how we're going to achieve net zero in our priority sectors, assuming we have the data to do so. We want to establish actions that enable some of the systems change that's needed in this space, not the least of which is having the right rigorous information on emissions in order to actually be able to track improvements or declines in improvement among our clients or ourselves. Very challenging with data that's got error bars of plus or minus 100% in some cases. we want to be able to disclose and reduce our enterprise and operational emissions, as we mentioned. And we also want to be able to share what we've learned with others, because we're kind of all in this together, and there isn't any particular competitive advantage in a lot of this to trying to go it alone when you're really talking about decarbonizing the entire economy. Just to recap on net zero, what does it really mean? So it means really reducing emissions as much as possible, and then anything that you can't reduce through, changes in your sources of electricity or your efficiency of your processes, et cetera, you would use offsets or removals. So for example, carbon capture and storage, or forestry, forest and land use changes. So, so basically, Canada has a net zero by 2050 goal, and as banks finance in Canada, we finance every part of the economy. We're really all in this together, because really what we're signing up for is helping enable this national and global goal. Just wanted to if you hear the terms Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, I'm not sure, and I can't see everybody's hands or anything, but I'd love to do a poll to know, like, who's completely familiar with Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions? Is that someone everybody already knows about? Put up your hands if you know about it, and Greg will tell me if the majority already know this. Assuming you know how to put your hand up in Teams, sorry. If Teams is new to you, you're probably like, what?
I would say that of those who know how to put up their hands, very few.
Okay, so I'll take a minute on this one. So basically, okay, thanks. Basically, when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, the greenhouse gas protocol looks at these in three ways. So Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions. So this is basically the smokestack, the chimney on your house, the tailpipe of your car, the things that are emissions that are from things that are owned or controlled by the reporting entity. Indirect emissions, or Scope 2 emissions, are essentially exclusively it's purchased electricity, steam, heating, or cooling. So this means that, for example, as a homeowner, your indirect emissions are the emissions associated, your portion of the emissions associated with the electricity that you use in your house. So the indirect emissions of a house in, let's say, British Columbia, where 90% of the electricity that you would get on the grid, I'm making the number up, I don't know if it's exactly 90, is non-emitting. Your Scope 2 emissions as a homeowner would be very small, because the electricity that you purchase has very few emissions associated with it. Conversely, the Scope 2 emissions of a house in, say, Saskatchewan or Alberta would be much higher, because the purchased electricity source is emitting more, because it uses more natural gas and coal to generate electricity in those provinces. So again, arguably, you don't have a lot of control over that yourself. I guess you could go off grid and hope that you survive a Saskatchewan winter. But I think that it's really important to note that Scope 2 emissions are essentially emissions related to the purchase of heat and electricity. And then Scope 3 emissions are the emissions associated with your supply chain and with your customers. And so again, for a homeowner, this would be, as I tell my kids, the emissions associated with the Amazon delivery trucks that come to our house every freaking day, dropping off more crap that the kids buy on Amazon. So my family's Scope 3 emissions from our supply chain would be the emissions associated with getting that thing to my house. So that's sort of incoming. And the Scope 3 downstream emissions, I'm having trouble thinking of it off the top of my head, but definitely for a bank, our downstream emissions would be the emissions associated with our customers, which, if as you've been hearing me talk about this, that's basically the whole economy, or pieces of the whole economy. And if you were an oil company, your downstream emissions are also the emissions associated with everything that uses oil and gas, which is indirectly everything. So scope 3 emissions are really interesting, an important concept, but as you can already imagine, that particularly those of us who are mathy and engineering, huge challenges in terms of how do you oops, somebody needs to go back on mute. How do you track these? So in October, the 6 largest banks announced that we're signing on to something called the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And so in summary, what this means is that we're going to pursue a net zero by 2050 goal for our lending and investment portfolios with interim 2030 targets. Furthermore, that we would set sector level targets for our carbon intensive sectors. Obviously, we would engage with our clients on this stuff, and that kind of goes without saying. We would be transparent about disclosing progress, and that we would be pragmatic and a bit cautious about the role of offsets. So we couldn't just make it all business as usual and buy a couple forests and consider that our work was done, but it had to do with making sure that we were genuinely looking at decarbonizing with our clients our financed emissions in our portfolio. So in terms of our project, the initial research that we did was to look at an estimate of, okay, here's all the sectors we lend to. Where do our emissions come from when you look at our portfolio? So interestingly, most of our financed emissions are estimated to come from agriculture and electricity portfolios, with oil and gas and residential mortgages being also way up there. So we selected those 4 sectors for our first net zero pathways project, and these are the steps that that we took. So first of all, getting a guess on where the emissions come from in our lending, then doing a deeper dive in terms of getting a baseline, looking at different scenarios that the world wants to get to for emissions and what that means for those 4 sectors, and then establishing targets and objectives on how we'll work with our clients to decarbonize those sectors and at what pace. So, and that report should be coming out within the next week. Well, I'm not going to give a date, but it'll be coming out shortly. But it's most of the work is essentially complete. So I would say that here's some challenges that I hope we can tap on into the discussion. Challenges with mapping out a net zero pathway. So I guess the first thing is, this whole thing about downstream emissions, scope 3 emissions. So the ability to meet national and global net zero commitments of your clients is really, by definition, it's largely outside of your direct control. So that's one of the challenges that we're grappling with and need to have had to be very thoughtful about. How do we tackle this when we're not talking about the emissions from our own operations, which it's also challenging, but we actually have tools that we can control to do that. Second thing is, divesting of sectors is not effective at reducing real world emissions. And I'll talk about each of these, by the way, in a little more detail. And also, well, I'll give you a hint. One of the reasons is because everything emits. And if you are legitimately trying to divest of things that have a carbon footprint, there's nothing left. And that's one thing. And then there's a few other reasons why this is an impractical solution. And the third thing is that pursuing abatement of our clients' emissions is certainly challenging. But furthermore, we've been asked to also look at their clients' emissions, if you can imagine. So what that means is there's deep concerns about how does this all add up properly. So let me just show you. First of all, the ability to meet commitments is largely out of our control. So this is why a big pillar of our activity has to do with stakeholder engagement, collaborations, sitting in on, providing input on public policy discussions, national and provincial net zero challenges for industry, because public policy is a huge, huge lever in both nationally, provincially, regionally, and globally in getting to net zero for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure you understand. Obviously, We also depend on technological innovation happening the way that everyone hopes, because some of these innovations have to scale up really rapidly. Even if they're already underway, they need to scale up. We also need consumer demand to shift. Certainly for a bank, like we can only finance stuff that's actually happening. So if nobody wants to buy, for example, an electric car, like we can't finance more electric cars if nobody is buying them. That's not a great example because I think there's huge pent up appetite for these, but it just gives you a sense of the fact that a lot of stuff is not in the direct control of finance, but we need to figure out what levers we can help push to move the needle in the right direction. Um, so in terms of the sort of a riff on that. So this is a graph showing where we need to go under one of the International Energy Agency scenarios for decarbonizing. So the y-axis is tons of carbon dioxide, and the x-axis is time. So getting carbon dioxide levels down where they need to be. This is annual emissions. Sustainable development scenario is the lower boundary of this wedge. Currently, we're on the red trajectory. So if you break this down into wedges of activity, it gives you a sense of all of the things that have to happen. Like there's no silver bullet, it's silver buckshot. All these things have to happen in order for these scenarios to come to fruition. There's a lot of them. The big buckets are absolutely, and we talked about these in my, remember these 5 things. Fuel switching, energy efficiency, and renewables are the biggies. And as you can imagine, those involve a lot of different players, including finance. Divesting. Divesting of sectors is not an effective way of reducing real world emissions. I mean, it can be a personal choice. If you're an investor and you don't want to invest in something because you just don't like it, well, of course you should have that ability to do that. But there is pretty much nothing that does not touch fossil fuels. Um, Divesting of oil companies is not the same as reducing emissions because every sector and every client emits GHGs. And the thing with, and I pick oil and gas because it's the thing that we get the most cards and letters about. While oil and gas is about 1.5% of Scotiabank's lending portfolio, it's certainly the disproportionate amount of activist shareholder conversations are about oil and gas. And I find it very interesting because the other 98.5% of our portfolio also emits. And in fact, it's the demand for oil and gas from all of us, including homeowners, as we found in our Net Zero Pathways project. Our portfolio of residential mortgages, and we haven't even characterized commercial yet, the carbon footprint of that portfolio is really, really, really big because we do a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of financing of homes in Canada, and certainly the financed emissions associated with residential mortgages, with the agriculture sector, with power and utilities, and with oil and gas for us are all almost about the same. So where would you start if you were going to divest? I don't know. The other thing that we're finding is that, I'm sorry, I can't keep up with the chat, so we'll have to read them later, but certainly this is happening in the States, and you can read up on it, it's quite interesting, where traditional banks have stepped away because of pressure, for example, to stop financing coal, which we know is a very high emitting fuel for generating electricity, and we're going to be eliminating that in Canada in the next few years. So traditional banks in some cases have said, you know what, we're not financing new coal, but if there's still a demand for electricity and there's no alternative, and that coal plant is not going to shut down because maybe the state doesn't have an alternative, and you can't let people freeze in the dark. So that coal plant may still be needed. Private equity is stepping in, and other sources of financing are stepping in order to provide the required capital, rightly or wrongly. So that's just one example there. And then the last challenge that we're facing is, it's a bit of a nerdy one, but boy, it's a big one for us. So these are our scope 3 emissions as a bank. So we finance all these sectors. You know, there's the dollars flowing to all these different sectors in the economy, but all these sectors are connected to each other. So when we start calculating, it's one thing if we're counting up the direct emissions from each of the sectors we finance. Arguably, that's still really hard because a lot of the sectors, i.e., millions of homes that we finance, we don't actually have data on the actual emissions from our residential real estate portfolio. We're having to estimate it because I'm sure you don't know what the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are from your house. I will say I don't know what they are from my house, although I'm probably in a better position than many Canadians to figure it out. Um, it's a really big challenge. That's just the direct emissions. We are facing pressure from some activists, well-meaning perhaps, that we should also be calculating and including when we tally up our financed emissions, our customers' scope 2 and scope 3, i.e. their customers' emissions. And that becomes problematic because they're all overlapping. And so that would mean that we're literally, if we were to add it all up, we're counting the same emissions, God knows how many times over in some cases. So we're trying to untangle this. It's not just Scotiabank, obviously, it's everyone in banking who's looking at this and going, the math just doesn't make sense. So we're going to have to figure something out here. So I'm going to stop with this one, but our pathway, which the project launched last April after we did the initial work, and the report's going to launch in the next month or so. We're basically going to be talking about, so essentially carbon neutral in our own operations, which I actually hope will also incent other companies to just aggressively get on with that because we do have control over our own operations. Increasing our target for mobilizing capital. So I'll give you a hint, it's 100 billion by 2025 now, but we're looking forward to having a more aggressive target and working harder with our clients on moving money into things that are really contributing immensely to decarbonizing the economy. We're also going to be committing to increasing our support for all of those academic and think tank and not-for-profits that are working on this area, on systems change and sector-related change. We're going to be setting targets for some of our priority sectors, and then of course working with our clients on actions to move the needle, and then doing things around data and applying our approach across additional sectors in addition to the 4 priority sectors that we identified earlier. This is just a summary of some of the levers. So engaging with our clients or counterparty engagement, changing the portfolio composition, advocating and working in advisory groups and consultation, supporting systems change through investments in all sorts of different things, and then of course contributing by looking in our own backyard and decarbonizing our own operations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandra, for a fascinating talk and a wealth of information. So we do have time for some questions, which is great. I think what we'll do, so there's a couple on the chat, so they went up first. So I think we'll give them first shot, and then I do see some others, people with hands up as well, and I'll get to those in just a second. So Amarashkin, do you want to give your question, or I could read it, but I prefer it if you read it because you'll be able to catch the meaning. So Amarashkin, go ahead.
Yeah. First, thank you so much. It was a very great and informative talk. Sorry if this question is very elementary. You were mentioning about decarbonizing process industries, and I was thinking maybe my point of view is too much classic. I usually think of organic feedstock, and it's hard to think of non-organic ones. But my general question is that when we talk about decarbonizing process industries, how much is it about actually blocking the flow of carbon from the start of the industry, I mean, using non-organic feedstock, versus still having those kind of feedstock, but trying to approach it through the net zero method?
I think it's all of the above, and to your point, it really depends on which processes you're talking about. So I think there's work underway on, on all fronts. Certainly, changing the organic, you know, uh, changing the feedstock in the first place so that the chemical reactions are different in order to produce something the same as or similar to the original product that you're seeking. That's certainly, that's a great challenge area for chemical engineers, of course. Another one, and actually that also, in terms of inorganic processes, I'm thinking about the challenge faced by the cement industry. That's not an inconsequential one, where just a byproduct of the process is a lot of CO2. So that's it's an organic and inorganic chemistry challenge there. Um, a lot of times too, the changes will involve, so there's definitely looking at the feedstock, looking at the actual chemical formulas and processes used to generate the product or service. Another one is energy efficiency and different types of fuel. So in a lot of industrial operations, you need to heat, you need to add heat or electricity, and so are you using the lowest carbon sources for that? That's one of the things, for example, that they're looking at in the oil and gas sector, in the oil sands, is, do they need to use more small modular reactors? Do they need to use different types of fuel for generating, say, for SAGD processing, to generate the heat to do SAGD? So it does depend on the process. So I would say it's all of the above.
So we have 4 questions, and we've got 2 minutes, but I think if it's okay with you, Sandra, if we go just a bit over.
Oh, I'm fine. I
Good.
think I'm fine. Yes.
Okay, so I think we're going to do them in the order that they came up. So it's Eric, Jay, Don, and then Marianne. So Eric, go ahead with your question. Eric, I don't know if you're on mute at the moment. All right, let's go to Jay, and I'm going to figure out if Eric, if I've muted you or something else. Jay, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thank you for the talk. Really, really interesting. So this might be a little tangential, but let's say a student, like you had in your one slide, there's a lot of opportunity when we have this major transition. So if there are students who have some business idea that relates to decarbonization, that relates to carbon capture or something like that, which obviously there's a lot of interest in, but so many places to go to, where do you think that a student like that should start?
Sure. In what, like, they have an interest in it in what regard? Like in terms of a job, in terms of having someone fund their invention? Like, I'm sorry, what do you mean?
Yeah, more the latter.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I would say there's a few things. There are a lot of different government incentives and government programs looking at innovation. So I don't think I could name them off the top of my head, but certainly that's one place to look. I would also say there's a number of different startup. If you have if you have an idea for a business, you probably want to hook up with a startup incubator or accelerator. One that I know of in BC is the Foresight. It's a clean tech startup accelerator that's gaining a lot of momentum, and they're actually doing, because you mentioned carbon capture and storage, they're actually doing a partnership with the company that I used to run, Carbon Management Canada. They're launching a partnership on CCS, sort of a CCS innovation accelerator and incubator. So I think a really important thing for anybody who has a cool new idea is that you need to get yourself connected to mentors and groups that help you refine your idea and turn it into something that looks like a business opportunity that you can then pitch to prospective investors, if that makes sense. And then and I just mentioned Foresight, but there's something like that in every province. In in Ontario, of course, in Toronto, we have the Mars Center, and they have a number of different programs as well.
Great, thank you. Don.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the really great talk, Sandra. It's great to see you, Greg.
Yes.
I also an alum of Greg's research group from a very long time ago, I think, and but currently lead a team at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy in British Columbia and dealing with industrial climate change policy. My question is about what Scotiabank and other financial institutions might be looking for from government in terms of policies to help really mobilize the capital necessary to get towards net zero.
Wow, just that little question. Yeah, I think, one of the biggies, to be honest, is policy certainty. And it hasn't been too bad lately, but price on carbon has been a very effective tool for incenting clients and banks to look at opportunities and be able to apply a little bit of a business lens to them. What I'd love, and I don't think anybody can ever make these guarantees, but obviously everybody would love to know that no future government's going to come in and completely come up with a whole new idea, because it's really hard to make progress when the rules change, every 4 years or something. So I think that policy certainty is like hugely important. I think that, a couple other things would be things that, and I think the government, the federal government and a lot of provincial initiatives as well across the country are doing some great things in this regard. But I'd say the next one I would say is to make sure to support, create policies that allow clean tech startups to stay and grow in Canada, so they don't get snapped up and have to go to the US, or usually it's the US, as soon as they need more financing. That also has to do with our VC, venture capitalists, and having the money as well to support them. I think another big thing, again, I would say just don't pull back on this, is supporting, large scale research and development that's going on for breakthrough climate solutions and technologies that not only that would be good in Canada, but that we can sell to the world. I think it's been a bumpy road in some ways, but I think we're doing a lot of things right. It's just the speed and scale just has to go faster and bigger.
Thank you.
Great. So there's something on the chat. So next we had Marianne.
Yeah, hi Sandra. Thanks a lot, and thanks for really just laying out the complexity. I think when you started and you had the 5 priority points, electrify, 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 I thought, no, it's not that easy. And then you finished by saying it's really not that easy, right? And it was really interesting to just get a glimpse of the complexity of the layout, right? I mean, you want to do responsible investment, but you want to stay in business, and there's all these other factors. My question is, sort of relates to the previous one. You talked about public policy as sort of an external thing, right? And I was wondering whether maybe there's a role for the private banks. Is there a role to play in steering that public policy in the right direction? And you're talking about investments, for example, in technology, right? Clean technology, electric vehicles. But we know that technology alone will not save us. Is how that technology is deployed in our cities, how people are using it, right? There's all this public infrastructure aspect of, building smaller cities and smaller homes and active transportation and public transit, all of this that the private banks are not getting into. But is there a role for the private banks to play in kind of steering these innovations in the right direction and in the right context?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, sort up to a point. I guess I'm going to unpack your question in two ways. So first of all, when you're talking about I love the example of some of the things we need to do in the urban environment. So my question to you would be, why do you think the banks are not, or are you sure the banks aren't getting involved in those things? Because you sort of, it was a sidebar, but you said we need to do this, this, and this, and the private banks aren't getting involved. And I'm like, I don't know about that.
Okay, that's a good point. Maybe you correct me on that. Then that would be great. Yes.
I guess I genuinely, I mean, to the extent that things are happening, I definitely think the banks are keen to get involved. I think that one of the things that's difficult, and this is partly to set up the answer to your question about, helping to push public policy, is I don't like I guess I would like to suggest that I don't know the extent to which you want your banker deciding on public policy. Like I really think it's up to the citizens to decide on the direction that society takes, and how much public transit do we or want versus at the expense, or how many bike lanes at the expense of car lanes, and how much public transit should go through established neighborhoods, and what's the balance between this neighborhood doesn't want it, but we need, like, all those questions. I don't think you want your bank deciding on the answers to that. And I mean, I'm giving you a little bit of a glib example, but it's a serious one, because we grapple with it as well. A lot of expectations that, well, why aren't the banks pushing this or that? And it's like, we don't actually develop public policy, and I don't know if I want to live in a country where any large corporation is given the ability to push public policy where the citizens should be doing it. And so I think that we definitely want to be at the table and informing it, and we want to be we want to be capable and smart enough to respond to it. And absolutely, we also do play a role in sometimes in saying, we're not financing that, or we put our foot down last year on financing. It's less of an issue now that the administration has changed in the US, but they were going to start developing the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or at least it was open for oil exploration. And we were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. So occasionally you sort of have to say no. But I think that to the extent that we can work with citizens and city builders and people, visionaries who want to create the low carbon future, we will. But I don't know that we should be in front of what the citizens want, because there's always trade-offs, and that really should be decided by the citizens.
So
nice. Very nice, thank you.
Okay, but it was a great question.
Yeah.
I said we would have 4 more questions, and we've had 4 more questions. So I think I'm going to end it here, even though I do see additional questions. But I do think that we could probably keep going for another couple hours. Fascinating talk, Sandra. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I have many new things to think about. I thought life was simple. Clearly it is not.
Scope 3 emissions, man. It makes my head hurt.
Yes, it does. The apportionment exercise, I'm sympathetic, and how not to double count.
Hey, Grant.
I think Grant Allen, our former chair, once upon a time, actually just a month ago, wants to say hello to you as well, Sandra. So
thanks. Hi, Grant. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Sandra. Great talk. I had a question, but I won't ask it because we've
put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put it in the
email
chat.
Me.
Right. Yeah. Okay. It's okay. Yeah.
So thank you all very much for joining us at this seminar. Let's do a virtual round of applause for Sandra for a fascinating talk.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And Sandra, you might close by telling us a bit about the background of the place that you're in, because I can recognize it, but many may not recognize what this is.
Yeah, sure. So this is a fake background. My real background is the basement with the rowing machine that my son and my husband persuaded us to buy last winter, and it's probably been used 8 times, but that's a whole other presentation. So this artificial background is the Downey Wenjack space in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. So Scotiabank is a supporter of. I don't know if anyone knows about the Downey Wenjack. Wenjack initiative, but Gord Downey basically started this initiative. I guess he started the Gord Downey and Chaney Wenjack Fund a number of years ago, and it was inspired by Chaney Wenjack, who was the 12-year-old Indigenous boy who basically died of hypothermia trying to escape a residential school. I'm sorry, I can't even remember what year it was, but the Downey Wenjack space in our branch in Yellowknife is intended to be a space that people can use for, well, not right now because of COVID, but for community events and the walls have a whole bunch of different Indigenous pieces of information. It's basically to inspire reconciliation and thoughtfulness about our history and our need for reconciliation. So we have one of those spaces in Yellowknife, and this is a picture of it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I thought people, since they've been seeing it for 50 minutes, might be recognize it, and I do know there's a couple very passionate, tragically hip fans in the audience here, so I figured I'd share that too.
Yeah,
I might be
Gord
one of
Downey
them. So.
Are you one too?
Yes. So thank you all for joining, and Sandra, we will no doubt run into you again at some other point once this pandemic thing is done with. So, and thank you everybody else for coming, and we'll have another seminar in a month where it'll be Sarah Haynes, a new prof in civil engineering, is going to give a talk. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Well done, Sandra.